My son changed the name on my mailbox while I was still connected to a morphine drip on the third floor of Norton Hospital. Not a hotel. Not a rental. My house. The house I had owned for 22 years. The house where his mother had planted the rose garden along the south fence in the spring of 2004 and tended it every April until she no longer could. The house where I had rebuilt the back porch with my own hands using reclaimed cedar from a demolished schoolhouse in Bardstown. He changed the name on the mailbox. He took mine off. He put his on. When I came home from 7 days of post-surgical recovery on a cold Tuesday afternoon in February, cane in my right hand and a paper bag of prescriptions rattling in my left, I stood at the end of my own driveway and read that mailbox for a long time. Derek W. Whitfield. Not Harold E. Whitfield. Not even just Whitfield. Derek W. Whitfield. His name. His claim. His quiet, confident declaration that something had changed while I was gone. I stood there in the Louisville cold with my cane pressing into the frost-hardened concrete, and I looked at that mailbox and I thought about my wife Ruth, who had painted it herself in the summer of 2009. Navy blue with a small red cardinal she had stenciled carefully on the side because she loved cardinals the way some people love a particular hymn. Quietly, consistently, and with a depth that most people never fully understood. The cardinal was gone. He had painted over it. The mailbox was now flat black. I did not yell. I did not call him. I picked up my prescriptions and walked to my front door and let myself inside and took a slow, systematic room-by-room inventory of everything that had changed while I was gone. Then I walked to my bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed. And I made one phone call. By Thursday morning, my son was the one scrambling to find somewhere to go. This is that story. And I need you to understand something before I tell it. I'm not a man who operates from anger. I am a civil engineer. I spent 40 years thinking in load tolerances and drainage gradients and structural sequencing. I understand that the thing that looks stable is not always structurally sound. I understand that what looks like patience is sometimes something more deliberate and more permanent than patience. My name is Harold Whitfield. I am 68 years old. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. And what my son did not know when he moved his entire family into my home and painted over my wife's cardinal, was that I had been preparing for exactly this moment for 14 months. He thought he was moving in. He was walking into something I had already built around him. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this story ends in a way that most people never see coming, and you do not want to miss a single word of it. My father was a plumber. He worked residential and light commercial in Louisville for 31 years and retired with a bad back, a paid-off house, and a handshake reputation that still meant something in the trades the day he died. He did not build wealth. He built stability, which is a different and harder thing because stability requires the daily discipline of not spending what you cannot afford to replace. I went to the University of Louisville in 1974, graduated with a civil engineering degree in 1978, and went to work immediately for a site development firm in Jeffersontown. I did that for 9 years, learned every corner of the business, and in 1987 I left with 3 clients, a used pickup truck, and a drafting table I had bought at an estate sale for $40. I started Whitfield Site Development and Engineering out of a 2-room office on Hurstbourne Lane. By 1995 I had 11 employees. By 2001, 27. By the time I retired in 2016, Whitfield Site Development had completed more than 480 commercial, municipal and residential site projects across 4 counties. 43 full-time employees. A project pipeline that ran 18 months forward at any given time. All of it from that $40 drafting table and a reputation I had never once allowed to become complicated. I sold 70% of the company to a group out of Cincinnati in 2016 for a number I will not state publicly but which allowed me to retire comfortably, retain a minority interest paying a quarterly distribution, and spend my time doing what I had earned the right to do. I bought the house on Westport Road in 2002. Ruth fell in love with the kitchen, with the light specifically, the way the morning sun came in through the east-facing window above the sink and stayed on the countertop until almost noon. She said it was the kind of light that made you want to stay inside and make something. Bread or soup or something that took all morning and filled the house with a smell that felt like a reason. Ruth in Whitfield was the most quietly precise person I have ever known. A high school English teacher for 23 years. She brought to that classroom the same quality she brought to everything, the absolute refusal to be approximate. She read every book she assigned twice before assigning it. She kept a notebook in the kitchen junk drawer where she recorded things she wanted to remember. Grocery lists alongside book quotes alongside the names of birds she had spotted that season alongside things I had said that she wanted to keep. I found that notebook after she died. I have read it more times than I will admit to anyone. Ruth was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the spring of 2019. She was not theatrical about it. She continued teaching through the fall semester, retired at Christmas, tended her roses through the spring of 2020 even when it cost her more than it should have. She died in February of 2021, 11 days after her 65th birthday, in the bedroom of the house on Westport Road with both of my children in the room and my hand in hers. The house felt different after she left it. Not emptier. Different. The way a load-bearing element being removed changes not the appearance of a structure but its fundamental internal logic. Derek and his wife Renee had been married 9 years by the time Ruth died. They had 2 children, Connor and Bryn, and lived in a house in Prospect that Derek had purchased with what he described as a very favorable investment arrangement. Derek was 42, worked in commercial real estate development, and had a particular talent for making himself the most credible person in any room. The trouble with Derek was not his intelligence. The trouble was that he had learned to treat proximity to something valuable as a form of ownership. He had grown up inside my success without ever having to build it, which created a particular kind of confidence that had no foundation. The confidence of a man who has always been near the structure but has never poured the concrete himself. My daughter Joanna was different. 38, living in Nashville as an occupational therapist, calling on Tuesday and Thursday evenings without being reminded. Driving up from Nashville twice that first winter without being invited, showing up with groceries and spending the weekend doing what needed doing without making a production of it. She had her mother's precision. Derek had always known it and had never quite forgiven either of them for it. I noticed the first signs of what was coming in the summer of 2022. Small things. A comment Derek made at a 4th of July cookout about the square footage of the house and what it was likely worth per square foot in the current market. A question Renee asked about whether I had thought about what I wanted to do with the house long term. A conversation Derek initiated about senior living communities, framed carefully as forward-thinking rather than a suggestion. I did not react. I filed it. I am a civil engineer. We do not react to early survey data. We record it, evaluate it against subsequent data, and draw conclusions when the pattern has confirmed itself sufficiently to be actionable. The pattern confirmed itself in September of 2022 when Derek called on a Wednesday, not a Sunday, and asked whether my estate planning was current. He used the phrase peace of mind 3 times in 4 minutes and mentioned a very good estate attorney he could connect me with. I thanked him. I told him everything was in order. I said nothing further. After I hung up I sat in the kitchen and looked at the light on the countertop and thought about Ruth. I thought about what she would have said if she had been sitting across from me at that table. She would have said, "Harold, you know what this is." I knew what it was. The question was what I was going to do about it before it became something I couldn't manage. My attorney's name is Catherine Boone. 54 years old, property and estate law, offices on West Main Street in downtown Louisville. I had worked with her on the sale of the company in 2016. Precise, economical with words, and possessed of the quality I value most in any professional. She tells you what you need to hear rather than what she calculates you want to hear. I called her on a Thursday morning in October 2022. I told her what I had been observing. The Sunday calls. The square footage comment. The estate attorney referral. The pattern assembled from 18 months of quiet data collection. I told her I was 67, that I had a house worth approximately $680,000, a retirement portfolio, a quarterly distribution, and a son who had recently become very interested in all 3. Catherine listened without interrupting. When I finished she said, "What do you want the outcome to be?" I said, "I want what I built to go where I decide it goes. Not where someone maneuvers it." She said, "Come in Tuesday and bring everything." What followed across a 2-hour meeting was Catherine reviewing every document I owned and then leaning back and looking at the river through her window for about 10 seconds. She said, "Harold, your structure is clean but vulnerable in one way. Your house is held in your name alone. It is the most accessible single asset you have if someone wanted to challenge your capacity or push for a conservatorship." I said, "How do we fix that?" She said, "A revocable living trust. You remain trustee while you're alive and competent. A successor trustee and beneficiary are designated. The house stops being an individual asset and becomes a trust asset, significantly harder for anyone to access without going through the trust structure." I said, "Who is successor trustee?" She said, "Someone with no personal stake in the outcome." I said, She said, "That is not a small ask, Harold." I said, "I know. You're the person I trust. And I need someone who will not flinch." She said, "I don't flinch. Think about it for a week." I called her back in 4 days. We began documentation in November 2022. The Robert H. and Ruth and Whitfield Family Trust was established in January 2023. The Westport Road property transferred into the trust that same month. Catherine became successor trustee. Joanna was named sole residential beneficiary. By the time Derek called warmly and casually in February 2023 to ask whether I had given any more thought to updating my estate plan, the house he was thinking about had been legally restructured for 6 weeks. I told him I had taken care of it. He said that was great. Really good to hear, Dad. I said I had always been a thoughtful person. He laughed. We talked about the kids for a few minutes and then he had to go. The hip was the thing that started it. I had been managing a deteriorating left hip since 2019. By November 2023, the surgeon at Norton Hospital, a precise and unhurried man named Dr. Elliot Faber, told me that management was no longer the right word. He recommended a total hip replacement. Standard procedure. 6 to 8 weeks of recovery. He wanted to schedule it for February. I told him February worked fine. Joanna came up for the surgery. I told her it wasn't necessary. She said she had already decided and asked if there was anything she needed to bring. I said just herself. She said that was already in the car. I told Derek on a Sunday call. He expressed concern warmly and efficiently and pivoted to logistics before the warmth had finished being expressed. He said he and Renee wanted to help. He said they thought the most sensible thing would be if they came and stayed at the house during my recovery. I said I appreciated the offer. I said Joanna would be there. I said I had home care arranged through Norton's program. I said I had it organized. He called back 4 days later. He said he had been thinking more about it and felt strongly. He said a house that size with one person in post-surgical recovery was not a safe situation. He said Renee was happy to help and had already started looking at what the logistics would involve. Renee had already started looking at the logistics of moving into my house before I had agreed. I called Catherine the next morning and told her about the second call. She said, Harold, I want to suggest something. The trust structure is solid. But there's one additional layer of protection I think we should discuss. Do you have a security system? I said I had a basic monitored alarm system. She said, I'm recommending cameras. Interior cameras in the common areas. Arlo makes a system that records to cloud storage with a 60-day rolling archive. I want everything that happens in that house documented on video with a timestamp. I asked her why specifically. She said, because if someone is going to make a move on your home, Harold, they're going to say things inside it that they would not say in writing. And I want those things in a format I can use. I ordered the Arlo system that afternoon. My neighbor Frank DeLuca, who had been my neighbor for 16 years and whose judgment I trusted more than almost anyone, came over on a Saturday and helped me install 4 cameras. Living room, kitchen, front entryway, and the hallway outside the master bedroom. Each recording continuously to cloud storage with a 60-day archive. All mounted flush with existing fixtures. Not visible unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. Frank asked while we were installing the last one whether I was sure about all of this. I said I was sure about all of it except the hip. He laughed. Then he said, Harold, you call me if anything goes sideways. Before you call anyone else except Catherine. I said I would. I meant it. The surgery was February 6th. Joanna drove up the night before. We had dinner at a Lebanese restaurant on Bardstown Road that Ruth had loved, ordered what Ruth always ordered, and talked about things that had nothing to do with surgery or Derek or any of it. It was exactly the kind of night I needed. I checked in at 6:15. Dr. Faber performed the surgery at 9:20. Joanna was there when I came around. She flew back to Nashville on the 9th because she had patients who needed her. She made me promise 3 times in the hospital hallway to call the moment anything felt wrong. I watched her walk to the elevator and felt the particular pride of watching a person you raised become exactly who they were always supposed to be. What I did not know was that on the evening of February 8th, Derek and Renee had arrived at my house with 2 children, 6 boxes for suitcases, and Renee's mother, a woman named Patricia Gould I had met exactly 4 times in 9 years. What I did not know was that on the morning of February 9th, Derek had removed my name from the mailbox with a flathead screwdriver and replaced it with a label that read Derek W. Whitfield. What I did not know was that over the following 6 days, while I lay in a hospital bed working through physical therapy and the slow careful work of learning to use a joint that did not yet feel like mine, Derek and Renee had systematically repositioned my house. My furniture was rearranged. Ruth's ceramic bird collection from the shelf above the fireplace was boxed and moved to the garage. My engineering books were boxed. The guest bedroom became Connor's room. The second guest room became Bryn's room. Renee's mother moved into the 3rd bedroom. And Derek and Renee moved into the master bedroom. My bedroom. Ruth's bedroom. The bedroom where Ruth died. I want to tell you what it felt like to stand at that driveway because it matters. I felt a number of things in approximately 4 seconds, and then every single one of those things went quiet. Not suppressed. Quiet. The way a job site goes quiet when an engineer calls a stop work. Everything pauses, recalibrates, and waits for the next instruction. What replaced the feelings was a clear and operational thought process. I had structured the trust. I had installed the cameras. I had told Catherine what I was anticipating, and she had told me what to do if it materialized. It had materialized. I walked inside. The living room furniture had been repositioned. The blue armchair Ruth had reupholstered herself in 2016 was against the wrong wall. The shelf above the fireplace was bare. The ceramic birds were gone. My bedroom door was closed. From behind it I could hear a television. I did not open it. I turned and walked to the guest bathroom, sat on the edge of the bathtub and called Catherine Boone. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "Catherine, I'm home." He moved in. She said, "All of them?" I said, "His wife. Their kids. Renee's mother. And I believe he and Renee are sleeping in my bedroom." Catherine said, "Harold, I need you to do something very specific right now. Go to the kitchen, sit down, and do not engage with Derek or Renee tonight. Do not discuss this with them. Do not indicate anything is wrong. Can you do that?" I said, "That is not difficult." She said, "Good. I'm going to send you a message tonight with a name and address. Tomorrow morning at 9 I need you to be there. Bring your cane and nothing else. I will have everything else ready." She said, "And Harold, I need you to know that as of the moment you walk through that door, the trust is fully operative, the cameras have been running since January, and every day Derek has been in that house has been recorded in timestamped cloud storage that we own." I said, "I know." She said, "Get some rest. This is almost over." I walked to the kitchen. I made a cup of tea. I sat at the table where Ruth and I had eaten breakfast every morning for 19 years and looked at a child's drawing on my refrigerator that said "Sweet Home." I already knew how it ended. Now, if you are watching this and you are in the middle of your own hard season, I want you to stay with me for what comes next. Hit that like button right now and subscribe if you have not already. Because the part 1 I'm about to tell you is the part that changes everything. Derek came into the kitchen at 6:15 that evening. He was wearing house slippers. In my kitchen. He said, "Dad, you're home. How are you feeling?" I said, "I'm managing." He said, "You should have told me you were being discharged. I would have come to get you." I said, "I had a car." He deployed the warmth he used when he needed a room to feel comfortable. He said they just felt I needed support, the space made sense, the kids were so happy having more room. The space made sense. My house. The space made sense. I said, "It's a lot to process after a week in the hospital. I'm going to bed early." He put his hand on my shoulder the way sons do when they have decided the power dynamic has shifted. I noted it. I went to the guest room and lay on the bed and did not sleep for a long time. But I was not thinking about Derek. I was thinking about Thursday. Catherine's message came at 9:47. One name, one address. Gary Malone. East Broadway. 9 in the morning. I was there at 8:50. Gary Malone was a 57-year-old man with a gray sedan, a quiet voice, and the unremarkable physical presence of someone you would not remember having passed in a parking lot. 22 years as a process server in Jefferson County. He shook my hand and said, "I understand we have a residential situation." I said, "My son moved his family into my house while I was in the hospital." He said, "Is his name on any deed, mortgage, or property document?" I said, "No." He said, "And the property is held in trust?" I said, "Since January of last year." He nodded the nod of a man confirming a diagnosis he had already made. He said, "Here is what happens Thursday. At 8 in the morning I will be at your house. I will knock on the front door. When your son answers, I will hand him a notice to vacate. He will have 48 hours to remove himself, his family, and all personal property. If he does not comply, we file for unlawful detainer with Jefferson District Court and the sheriff handles the rest." I said, "How long does this typically take?" He said, "The notice is 15 seconds of my time. The legal compliance window is 48 hours. The full unlawful detainer process, if it goes that route, is 10 to 14 days. It rarely goes that route." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because when people see the paperwork and understand what they're dealing with, they prefer to avoid the alternative. The alternative involves a sheriff. People don't like the sheriff." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "You're pretty calm for someone dealing with this." I said, "I've been dealing with it for a while. Thursday is just the part where it gets visible." He almost smiled. He said, "I like that." Come back tomorrow afternoon to sign the paperwork. I'll see you Thursday at 8. That evening I went to the workshop and opened the Arlo Systems laptop interface for the first time since coming home. I pulled up the archived footage. What I found was worse than I had anticipated. Not dramatically worse. Categorically worse. The cameras had been running since January 4th. February 8th showed Derek and Renee arriving with boxes, suitcases, Patricia Gould carrying a casserole dish and surveying my living room with the proprietary expression of someone evaluating a space they have recently acquired the right to modify. I watched Renee remove Ruth's ceramic bird from the shelf and wrap it in a kitchen towel and place it in a box. I watched her stand back and tilt her head to one side, deciding how to fill the space she had just cleared. I paused the footage there for a moment. I breathed. I continued. February 9th. 6:12 in the morning. Derek with a flathead screwdriver at the front door. Taking my mailbox label off. Fixing his. 6 minutes and 40 seconds. I watched all of it. Then the evening of February 9th. Derek and Renee in the kitchen. Renee making something at the stove. Derek leaning against my counter with a glass of wine. I turned up the audio. Derek said, "She's gone. He won't be discharged until at least Tuesday. That's 9 days minimum." Renee said, "And after he's discharged?" Derek said, "Recovery is 6 to 8 weeks. He is going to need help. We document that we were here providing that help, and when the question of long-term capacity comes up, we have 9 weeks of on-site support on record." Renee said, "What do you mean when the question comes up?" Derek said, "You saw him at Thanksgiving, Renee? He's 68. He's having a major surgery. He is alone in a house this size. There is going to be a point where his physician raises the question of whether independent living is appropriate. And if we have been here managing things, we are the logical choice to step in." Renee said, "And the house?" Derek set his wine glass down on my counter. He said, "The house is his primary asset. If we are managing his affairs, the question of what happens to this house becomes a question we have significant input into." Significant input. I sat in my workshop and I listened to my son describe a plan for my life assembled while I was sedated on the 3rd floor of a hospital. I listened to him describe me, Harold Whitfield, civil engineer, 40 years of practice, 480 completed projects, as a trajectory toward diminished capacity. A problem to be positioned around. An asset to be managed. I closed the laptop. I sat in the cedar and oil smell of my workshop for 4 minutes. 4 minutes is enough to feel what needs to be felt and decide what needs to be decided. I have never confused processing with productive use of time. Then I called Catherine. I said, "Catherine, I need you to hear something." I played her the February 9th audio over the phone. When it finished she was quiet for 6 seconds. Then she said, "Harold, upload the full cloud archive to the secure file share I'm sending you right now. Every day from January 4th to today." I said, "Done tonight." She said, "And Harold, I want you to know that the language about managing affairs and having significant input into what happens to the house could constitute evidence of intent to exert undue influence over an elder's estate. That is a thing the Kentucky State Attorney's Office takes a particular interest in." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you sure you want to go that route?" I said, "I want to go the right route." "You tell me what the right route is." She said, "Let's get through Thursday first. Upload the footage tonight. Get some rest. I'll have everything ready for Gary by tomorrow afternoon." I uploaded 142 gigabytes of timestamped cloud footage that night. I encrypted it. Sent Catherine the access credentials. Then I went inside, made a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and slept in the guest room for the first full night since coming home. Derek came into the kitchen at 7:15 the next morning and found me eating my usual breakfast. Scrambled eggs. Wheat toast. Black coffee. He said, "You're up early. How'd you sleep?" I said, "Fine." He said, "We were thinking we'd put a play set in the backyard. Nothing permanent, just while we're here." "While we're here." I said, "That sounds like something to discuss." He said, "Of course. No rush." I said, "There really isn't." I finished breakfast. Washed my own dishes. Went to the workshop. At 2:15 I drove to Gary's office and signed the paperwork. The notice to vacate, formally executed, legally compliant, notarized, specific in its language about the trust-held status of the property, Derek's lack of any legal interest, and the 48-hour compliance window. Gary reviewed the signed paperwork. He said, 8 o'clock Thursday. I said, "I'll be in the workshop." He said, "That's the right idea." At 8:03 Thursday morning I heard the knock at the front door. Pause. Another knock. Footsteps from the master bedroom. Derek's voice, sleep-roughed, the voice of a man who is not expecting anyone. The front door opening. Then silence. Not the silence of no sound. The silence of all sounds stopping at once. The particular acoustic event that happens when something changes so fundamentally in the space where a person is standing that their body stops producing the small sounds of ordinary existence. I heard Gary Malone's voice, flat and professional. "Mr. Derek Whitfield?" Gary said, "My name is Gary Malone. I am serving you with a notice to vacate this property on behalf of the trustee of the Westport Road Family Trust, the legal holder of title to this residential property. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises and remove all personal property. The full details of your obligations and the consequences of non-compliance are in the notice. Do you have any questions?" A very long silence. Then Derek's voice. A voice I had not heard before. Not in 42 years. The voice stripped of every layer of rehearsed warmth. Bare and bewildered and beginning to understand the actual dimensions of what he was standing in. He said, "What is this? What does this mean?" Gary said, "The property is held in the Westport Road Family Trust. You have no legal interest here. You are residing without the trustee's consent. This notice gives you 48 hours to vacate." Derek said, "My father lives here. I'm here helping my father." Gary said, "The trustee is Catherine Boone, an attorney in Louisville. Her contact information is in the packet. Have a good morning." The front door closed. Derek standing in the entryway. Not moving. The absolute stillness of a man whose calculation has encountered a variable he did not know existed and is now trying to rebuild the entire equation from scratch. Then his voice very quiet to Renee, "Come here. You need to see this." I sat at my workbench. I looked at the old site plans on the drafting surface and I thought about load tolerances. About what a structure can hold and what it cannot. About the moment when the math stops being theoretical and becomes the event itself. Derek came into the kitchen 11 minutes later holding the notice to vacate in both hands the way you hold a document when you are hoping that reading it again will change what it says. He set it on the table and looked at me. He said, "Dad, what is this?" I said, "It's a notice to vacate." He said, "I know what it says. When did you do this? What did you do?" I said, "I set up a living trust in January of last year, Derek. The house transferred into the trust at the same time. Catherine Boone is the successor trustee. Joanna is the residential beneficiary." He stared at me. I watched him walk the timeline backward, through the Sunday calls and the estate planning conversation and everything he thought he had understood about the shape of things. I watched the reassembly failing because the pieces he had were built on an assumption that no longer existed. He said, "You did this on purpose." I said, "I did this to protect an asset I built over 40 years. He said, "You did this because you knew what we were doing." I said, "I did this because I am a civil engineer, Derek. I build structures that account for foreseeable loads. I foresaw the load." He said, "This isn't right. You had no reason to cut me out." I said, "I haven't cut you out of anything. You are welcome to consult Catherine about what the trust provides for. But you are not welcome in this house after 48 hours. That is what the document says." He said, "I have 2 kids here. I have Renee's mother here. I can't be out in 48 hours. I said, "That's what the document says, Derek." He said, "I'll get a lawyer." I said, "Catherine's contact information is in the packet." He picked up the document, looked at it once more. Then he looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was a child and had been caught in something he could not talk his way out of. Raw and uncalculated. The face underneath the face. He said, "Did Mom know?" I said, "Your mother knew me for 33 years. She understood how I think." "Yes, Derek. She would have known." He left the kitchen. I heard him and Renee in the master bedroom, voices low and urgent. I heard Renee begin to cry. I heard the children, high and oblivious, the beautiful ordinary obliviousness of children who do not yet know that the adult world underneath them is being reorganized. I poured my tea. I sat at the table. I looked at the morning light on the countertop. The same east-facing light that Ruth had loved in this kitchen. The light that stayed until almost noon. I had one more thing to do. I called Catherine at 9:15. I told her Derek had received the notice. I told her what he had said about a lawyer. Catherine said, "Good. That's expected. And Harold, I have to tell you something about the footage." She said, "I've reviewed a second conversation from February 14th. Derek made a phone call in the kitchen at approximately 10 in the evening. He appeared to believe he was alone. He discusses a plan to have you evaluated for cognitive decline by a physician he describes as someone who can be worked with. He mentions the house's market value. And he makes reference to a POA document he says he already has your signature on." I went very still. I said, "I have never signed a power of attorney document for Derek." Catherine said, "I know. But Harold, if there is a fraudulent POA document with what appears to be your signature on it, that is a criminal matter. That goes to the Kentucky Attorney General's Elder Abuse Unit. That is not a civil trust dispute. That is a crime. The silence in my kitchen lasted a long time. Catherine said, I am not going to move on this without your instruction. This is your decision. But I want you to understand what you have. I said, what do I have? She said, 42 days of cloud archived video. Audio of your son describing a plan to have you evaluated for incapacity by a compliant physician. Audio of him referencing a POA document you did not sign. A son who moved into your house and told his wife that you becoming the baseline was the plan. All of it time-stamped. All of it admissible. All of it mine to use if you say the word. I looked at the light on the countertop. I thought about Derek at 8 years old in the backyard of our first house, running in circles for the simple physical joy of it. Not knowing anything yet. Just running. I thought about what Ruth would have said. I said, Catherine, let's do this in the right order. Get him out of the house first. If he's gone clean inside 48 hours, we hold the rest in reserve. I will think about what I want to do with it. Catherine said, that's more than fair, Harold. She paused. Then she said, you are a remarkably calm person. I said, I am a logistics man. Calm is a professional requirement. Derek began moving things out Thursday afternoon. Organized, deliberate, communicating that this was a choice rather than a removal. He was not a man capable of an undignified retreat. I stayed in the workshop. Frank came over in the evening and sat with me for a while, drinking coffee and not saying much. He understands that some things don't need commentary. At one point he said, Ruth would have had a word for all of this. I said, she had a word for everything. He said, what do you think it would have been? I thought about it. I said, solvable. Frank nodded. He said, yeah, that sounds right. By Friday noon the house was mine again. The master bedroom was the master bedroom. Ruth's ceramic birds I found wrapped in kitchen towels in 3 separate boxes in the garage, all intact. I put them back on the shelf one at a time on a Saturday afternoon and stood back and looked at them. I drove to the garden store and bought a flat of early spring seedlings, varieties Ruth had grown, because the rose garden along the south fence was still dormant in February but the beds needed preparation. Before I close this out, I want to speak to you directly. If you have built something with your hands and your years and your name and you have felt the edges of someone trying to take it from you before you are ready to let it go, this story is for you. Share it right now with one person who needs to hear it. The person who is still in the hard years and cannot yet see what they are building. Tell them to stay with it. Tell them that patience is not the same as surrender. And hit that subscribe button if you are not already here, because every week on this channel there is a story about exactly this kind of person. The one who built and protected and did not fold. The question of the footage and the potential fraudulent POA stayed with me for 3 weeks. I did not act quickly. I talked to Catherine twice more and each time she gave me the same answer. The option was available whenever I was ready. What I eventually decided was not the part with the most drama, deliberately. Because I am not interested in maximum damage. I am interested in correct outcomes. I instructed Catherine to send Derek a letter. Not a legal filing. A letter on her letterhead, stating that the trust had completed a full review of the cloud archived footage and that certain conversations of concern had been identified and preserved. That no referral to the Attorney General's Elder Abuse Unit had been made at this time. That this decision was subject to review if any further action was taken regarding the estate, the trust, any property, or Harold Whitfield's legal capacity. The letter also asked, in specific language, whether Derek was in possession of any document purporting to be a power of attorney executed by Harold Whitfield, and that if such a document existed, it was to be surrendered within 5 business days. Catherine sent the letter on a Thursday. The following Tuesday a courier arrived at her office with a sealed envelope. Inside was a power of attorney document bearing a signature close enough to mine to be concerning and different enough to be identifiable. The document was notarized by a Louisville notary whose license was reviewed by the Kentucky Secretary of State's office within the following month. I did not push further. I have chosen not to push further. Derek is no longer in my house. He has not called on Sundays. Joanna drives up from Nashville more often now and stays longer, and we have fallen into a rhythm of Saturday mornings at the kitchen table that feels like something that should have existed sooner. The rose garden is doing well this spring. The ceramic birds are back on the shelf above the fireplace. All 14 of them. I cleaned each one before I put them back and stood at the shelf for a while when they were all in place and thought about the woman who had collected them over 30 years, one at a time, from the places we had traveled and the people who knew she loved them and the estate sales where she had found something unexpected and described it to me with the quiet excitement she reserved for things found rather than bought. She would have found what Derek did recognizable and sad and probably inevitable in the way that certain structural failures are inevitable when you build without understanding load distribution. She would have been precise about it. She would not have been theatrical. She would have written something in her notebook and refilled the bird feeders and continued. I am continuing. The minority interest distribution comes quarterly. The retirement accounts are intact. The house on Westport Road is still in the trust. Joanna still the beneficiary, Catherine still the successor trustee. Everything I built is where I put it. My father told me once that the mark of a good plumber was that nobody ever called him back. The work just worked. Year after year, quietly, without drama, functioning exactly as intended. That is also the mark of a good civil engineer. And I like to think it is also the mark of a man who built something worth protecting. I built it worth protecting. And when it needed protecting, I was ready. That is the only inheritance that actually matters. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Hit that like button. Subscribe so you never miss a story. I will see you in the next one.